With Going Live, the BBC cemented its place as the undisputed kings of Saturday morning, a position they would occupy for over a decade. While they remained solid as a rock throughout the 90s, the post-deregulation ITV flailed about in an increasingly undignified fashion, incapable of finding a format or a concept that worked. Only the summer was on anything resembling an even keel, and that was just because the BBC seemed to get bored and wander off eventually. SatAM belonged to the corporation. It was theirs to lose.
This is the BBC television service.
Going Live ended in 1993, although I'm not sure that was the original intention, given that the sixth and ultimately final series sported a lavish and expensive new title sequence, imagining the colour bars of test transmission as a setting for some kind of cathode ray tube take on the numbskulls. It won awards, and I'm fairly sure it was complicated enough that they wanted to use it for more than just the one series, but Schofield and Green had to move on.
Bye-bye. Bye. See you soon. Come on.
Schofield went to ITV, who spent millions tying him down and then couldn't think of anything for him to do, except for null and ill-thought-out light entertainment formats that turned him prematurely grey. Meanwhile, Green was murdered by a ghost. The BBC and producer Chris Ballinger decided that Green and Schofield were so heavily associated with Going Live that the show without them was unthinkable. So in April 1993 it was gracefully retired after 6 glorious years. That is, the name was retired. The show, for all practical purposes, survived. The same structure was retained, the same features continued, electronic telephone games, Run the Risk, The Hot Seat, even Trev and Simon returned unaffected. Only the title and faces had changed. Replacing Schofield was Black Alan Partridge Andy Peters, the third steward of the broom cupboard in a row to be promoted to head a SatAM show, which by now was the pinnacle of children's TV presenting and a potential stepping stone to primetime. Peters was and is far from a bad presenter, but he's always been a classic case of too much too soon, having got the broom cupboard gig at 19. Hands up if at that age you weren't a self-important prick. If your hand is down, you are a liar. Convinced by his success that he possessed some kind of incredible genius, he quickly grew an ego as big as the world. It happens. Gaining Saturday morning primacy a few years later didn't help. Peters had a sort of live audition on Going Live as a vague sort of video games correspondent. Meanwhile, Green's replacement was a Going Live stalwart, Emma Forbes, who had hitherto presented a cooking slot which doubled as a confusing Philip Schofield slot. As the daughter of washing up Imperiatrix Nanette Newman, she was and is middle-class showbiz down to her DNA, and no bad thing. There were additions. The new show would have a third presenter in a young, pre-Botox John Barrowman, who even then was a cross between Frankie Howard, Tom Cruise, and some kind of hitherto unknown tinsel-based lifeform. For the first series, he was ostensibly on an equal footing with Andy and Emma, but a lack of chemistry combined with the relentless flinging of innuendos and near-the-knuckle ad-libs got him demoted to the pre-recorded entertainment news roundup, Electric Circus. Meanwhile, there's also a vacancy for puppet sidekick, as Gordon the Gopher had departed with Green and Schofield. His successor was a major departure, a high-tech live-animated CGI severed cat head known as Rats. He was the first many people saw of the new show, showing up on CSO in the broom cupboard to float in the air in front of a confused Toby Anstis, and he didn't bode well. Initially intended as a high-tech link man, he was quickly limited to a regular slot of bantering with Barrowman about video games, before being quietly dropped after the first series in favour of Mitch Johnson, a straightforward voiceover in the Alan Dedicoat mould. To underline the fact that the new show was an explicit sequel to Going Live, it was given the title Live and Kicking. Notably, the new title sequence involving the show symbolically pinballing through the much-missed television centre didn't depict the presenters, as 2 out of the 3 counterparts on Going Live had, not to mention Swap Shop and Superstore. Where Going Live was, as a brand subordinate to its presenters, Live and Kicking was intended to overpower and potentially outlive them, which is how it proved. But meanwhile on ITV they were just getting the hang of the Going Live format with Motormouth, which by now was a fun show in its own right and a worthwhile alternative to the BBC show. In the autumn of 1991, Series 4 made its debut, and for the first time, Motormouth kept the same basic look, feel and cast over 2 seasons. Unfortunately, a few weeks later, its producers TVS lost their ITV franchise, and having overspent like maniacs in a failed attempt at building a global media empire, were basically doomed without it. Right when it was finding its groove, Motormouth was brought to a screeching halt in the summer of 1992, simply by outside circumstances. Gabby Roslin went to the big breakfast. Neil Buchanan formed his own production company, the Media Merchants, based in Maidstone, to keep Art Attack going. We'll meet with them again. Andy Crane, however, stuck around to continue heading ITV's Saturday mornings. Well, they needed a replacement, right? And when TVS lost their franchise, their director of children's programming, Nigel Pickard, who'd been behind the likes of Number 73, Art Attack, How To and Motormouth, jumped ship to Scottish Television as head of entertainment and drama. His record at Maidstone had made him sufficiently in demand to dictate terms. Scottish would take on How To, Art Attack and the new SatAM show in exchange for his services. This apparently was quite agreeable to Scottish, as long as the remains of TVS got the new show started. At the time, the contract to show Warner Brothers animated content, old and new, belonged to ITV. Their new flagship SatAM show took full advantage of this by contacting Warner's and, with their collaboration, making an explicit and outright advertorial series for Looney Tunes, Warner Brothers films, Warner Village cinemas and theme parks, and related merchandise. As you can imagine, Warner's had absolutely no problem whatsoever with such a concept, and fortunately for ITV, they were going through their Spielberg-driven renaissance, so they had the likes of Tasmania and Animaniacs as selling points, not to mention Batman. The show was christened What's Up Doc, because who needs subtlety? And Andy Crane was joined by Blue Peter pixie Yvette Fielding and die-hard mullet loyalist Pat Sharp, best known for the CITV game show Funhouse, run around on a dangerous sugar high. It was a pretty good lineup. Crane had the big brotherly laid-back authority of the broom cupboard, Fielding had the grasp of tone that came from a tour of duty in the Blue Peter trenches, and Pat Sharp, well, Pat Sharp is often dismissed on his hair alone, and I'd be lying if I claimed that was unjustified. But as a child of this generation, I don't think it's fair. He was corny as hell when he wanted to be. Help save the London child, people at Redditch. But he was also an engaging and confident presenter. He did Funhouse for 10 damn years without flagging, and he had a good line in deadpan humour calculated to fly over the heads of the juvenile viewers. It's ultimately the humour that What's Up Doc is best remembered for, exemplified not only by Sharp, but by a whole David Lean cast list of puppets and costume characters far too extensive to go into in detail. They're almost all played by Stephen Taylor Woodrow and Peter Cox, and included Balgit, who looked like a hairball and talked like the Cookie Monster, Gaston the Gaston, a wheelchair-bound frog chef with a French accent, Simon Perry, the archetypal anorak character that was so popular in those days, later reprised in Twix advertising under the name Norm, and most notable of all, the wolves, Bro and Bro, played by John Eccleston, who previously operated Gilbert the Alien, and Don Austin. Bro and Bro were the show's real breakout stars. They even got their own spin-off show, Wolf It, in which they ran around the CITV studios in Birmingham ad-libbing like there was no tomorrow, in between Looney Tunes cartoons. Their semi-improvised rambling about eating, spectating children and or that week's celebrity guests were just one of the many examples of arch, near-the-knuckles student humour that kept getting What's Up Doc in trouble with the ITC. If they weren't cracking blatant innuendos,
if things do get nasty, he can always squeeze his primula. Yeah.
They were actively encouraging kids to be naughty.
Yeah, with a hairy hood. Now, for that, you go to your mum's wardrobe and you take out her fur coat, Don't bother to ask, because she's only going to say no. Cut a bit out the back of that.
Or otherwise, just practically putting their fists up and yelling, "Do you want some?" at the ITC.
Oh, this tap water blondie is so filthy in this country because it has pissed through so many people before we...
Yeah.
Oh.
About 7, actually. Miss Rose, about 7 people. If you live in London, I think your tap water's been through 11. There's a thought.
Which was a tactic that could very easily have backfired, and did. It was the Warner Brothers connection that swung the issue in the end. After repeatedly being put on the naughty step by the ITC, the chairman of Scottish, Sandy Ross, started worrying that WB would pull the plug, and called in the producers Vanessa Hill and Ged Allen to request, in the sense of command, that they tone the show down. Their response was to resign in protest after a season and a half, amid support from almost everyone involved with the show, which made no difference to Ross or the ITC, and the second series of What's Up Doc ended with a mass exodus of all the funny characters and puppets, including, most damagingly of all, Bro and Bro, with Austin and Eccleston symbolically defecting over to Live and Kicking, to fill its puppet comedy slot vacated by Rats, with a pair of leprechauns called Sage and Onion. It was largely the same shtick, with Irish accents and less focus on eating people, but it was a good shtick, so no one cares. Eccleston also took over Run the Risk from Shane Ritchie, but wasn't terribly comfortable appearing on screen without a puppet, so that didn't last. Although he was still preferable to his own successor, Bobby Davro. Back at What's Up Doc, with the show under orders not to be funny anymore, and most of its funny surgically removed anyway, Series 3 saw an inevitable ratings collapse that killed the show. Didn't help that Live and Kicking just entered its imperial phase over on the other side, but we'll come back to that. Still, there was always the summer, which ITV tended to come out on top of in the 90s, if only by default. What with one thing and another, Ghost Train, with its convoluted premise and franchise roadshow format, finally became too much trouble to continue with after 1992. So Tineties brought the whole thing indoors to their City Road studios, replaced the entire cast except Nobby the Sheep, and titled it after the first modern kids expression that came to mind. Gimme 5 was pretty good. More Jenny Powell is never a bad thing. And Nobby did seem more comfortable in a standard shiny floor setting, but it wasn't anything particularly special. It was pretty much what had become the standard format. Shouty presenters, celebrity guests, live music, messy games, all in a cavernous, multicoloured studio. It ran for 3 summers in 1992, 93 and 94. At the same time, the BBC was embracing independent production companies, and summer 1992 saw the debut of the first SatAM show to be made by an outsider, specifically Roach & Partners. It was called Parallel 9, and went all in on its premise in a way no BBC programme ever had before. And that was its downfall, because this was the stupidest premise a SatAM show ever had. Here's the extended opening titles from the first episode that supposedly set the scene. See if you can figure it out.
Calendula.
Guilty! The Time Barons will take time away from you. From now until forever, you will only wake for 2 hours on the 6th day of the 7 cycle. You will only know the day they call Saturday. Do you have anything to say?
Oh, Bumbles.
It's time for you to pay. Just 10 minutes. You've broken every rule.
So in case you didn't get all that, the old dude with the prehensile eyebrows is called Mercator, and he's some sort of alien wizard person who's got in trouble for contacting some human girl called Calendula, a very popular girl's name, which is against whatever laws of whatever race, and so he's been sentenced to the phantom zone of Parallel 9, where time runs backwards, and he only gets 2 hours a week of awareness, which is what the show is. What could be simpler than that? Almost anything. But there you go. Basically, it's the premise of the Pertwee era of Doctor Who reimagined by a schizophrenic Liberace with a hangover. Alongside Roddy Maud Roxby as Mercator was Helen Atkins as Calendula, who Mercator had accidentally got trapped in Parallel 9 along with him. And 3 comic relief douchebags called Steel, Skin and Think So, sentenced to the same place before him. Oh, and a sentient table decoration called the Dinotrope, who served as linking narrator. Each week there were plot ways of getting out of Parallel 9 and going home to their respective planets, and each week they would fail, as even the thickest child watching knew they would, because if they'd succeeded, there would be no programme. An obvious narrative flaw always overlooked in programmes of this nature. They would also introduce cartoons, interview the likes of C.C. Peniston, and provide live music, which was all rather jarring amidst the science fiction premise. It wasn't actually bad as such, the production values were pretty good, the whole thing going out in cinematic widescreen, although since just about all televisions at the time were still in 4:3 ratio, this wasn't much of an advantage and amounted to an unnecessarily letterboxed image. And it had a pretty good theme tune. It was just really heavy going of a morning just to comprehend and follow the premise, when all you wanted from this sort of show was some cartoons, games, phone-ins and a modicum of witty banter, all for its own sake instead of being justified by some high concept. And that's what we were getting on the other side in the shape of Gimme 5, with added Jenny Powell. It may have been unremarkable in format, but at least when Jenny interviewed the Manic Street Preachers, she didn't have to keep half her mind on maintaining the character of a time convict from the planet Zarbiad trapped in a parallel dimension. The cast of number 73 had enough trouble, and they were just playing ordinary people. Parallel 9 wasn't a total ratings failure, however, and Roach and Partners were contracted for another series, so it came back in the summer of 1993. Sort of. It was It was called Parallel 9, it was partially set in space, and there were characters called the Dinotrope and Mercator, but absolutely everything else was thrown out. A link to Earth was established via a caravan inhabited by home and away escapee Lucinda Cowden. She was essentially now the main host, but the cast back in Parallel 9, which was now a research station, now consisting of a completely different Mercator, a prissy black guy, a woman called Z with a bob you could cut your finger on, and a puppet dinosaur called Brian, apparently from the Darcy to Farcy agency.
I would like to scream an emotional, moving, heart-rending cup of tea, eh?
It was neither better nor worse. Its premise had been simplified to a basic kiddie sci-fi level, which was no bad thing, but it was still unwieldy by definition for a show of this nature. The third series showed up in 1994 with yet another new Mercator and Maid Marian Kate Lonergan replacing Z. It was mostly notable in hindsight for the other new character, the Little Green Man. The whimsically enchanting running gag with him was that everyone hated him on general principles, and he was desperately lonely.
Well, do you think we're the type of guys who would hang out with some bogey-like creature?
Okay. Who's got bad breath? And where's his underpants on the outside?
I don't think so.
Oh, will you sing a song for me then?
No.
If I go away, will you sing a song for me?
Yeah, definitely. What do you want to hear?
Away.
He was like a child-friendly Mo Sizlak with an even more annoying voice. What was notable about him was that he was played by Martin Lomax from The Human Centipede 2. I'm not kidding. That's Lawrence R. Harvey at the age of 24 painted green. He actually performed quite well in a thankless role, and even got the show's last word.
Shall we?
To replace it, the BBC went back in-house. The children's department at BBC Northwest closed since 1993, the slot was handed to BBC Scotland, who came back with fully booked. Yet again, it was a show with a premise, but this time it wasn't a complicated science fiction backstory, just a we're all pretending to be running a hotel. Your hosts this time were Grant Stott and Zoe Ball, with a giant puppet cow named Morag, ostensibly the receptionist at the hotel that is the show. With no high concept and no characters to maintain, it was a pretty decent Saturday AM replacement over the Britpop summer of 1995. Meanwhile, things were afoot at Live and Kicking. Not only had Austin and Eccleston joined the fray, but after 3 series, Andy Peters was leaving to spend more time with his ego. He departed in a famously tearful final episode.
I just want to say thank you to everyone. I can't do it.
No, don't worry.
Take us with you.
But thanks to everybody, the production team, the crew, and whoever gets my job. You've got the best job in the world because you're working for her, which is just
No, you're the best.
fantastic.
Don't behave yourself, you're not being drafted. And anyway, he was wrong. Because although Emma Forbes was at that point planning on staying on, over the course of the summer she discovered she was great with child, which was due halfway through the series. Rather than make a whole big Tina Heath thing about it, she decided to step aside as well, popping in for one last appearance at the start of the new series to be interviewed by her replacement, that very same Zoe Ball, who'd proved so engaging, charismatic and not drunk on Fully Booked, she was bumped up from lifeboat to flagship at relatively short notice. Alongside her was another fresh-faced young thing named Jamie Theakston, who'd been discovered hosting sports radio on GLR and the abortive Radio 5 and parachuted into music magazine The Ozone, spookily also as a replacement for Andy Peters. For the first time, a BBC Saturday AM show outlived its lineup. Live and Kicking was a brand in itself. What no one expected was for this all-new lineup to gel quite so well, quite so fast. Jamie and Zoe were a near instant hit with each other and the viewers. Although both were roughly the same age as Andy Peters, they somehow seemed younger, looser, more laid back, less uptight, which has a lot to do with Andy Peters' personality, of course, but his style of presentation wasn't that different from Philip Schofield's, and Emma Forbes followed in Sarah Green's footsteps almost exactly. But times had moved on. Kids still wanted elder sibling figures, but not sensible ones, even to the extent that Schof and Sarah were sensible. They wanted cool elder siblings who listened to cool music and wore cool clothing, and whose ability to drink alcohol and smoke cigarettes, while obviously never actually mentioned directly, allowed us to stand in awe of them. This was Live and Kicking's imperial phase. Ratings went insane. Under Zoe and Jamie, the Saturday AM slot became the place to be seen for anyone who wanted their career to last more than 8 minutes, even if it didn't guarantee the full quarter hour on its own. This was the era when the term tween was coined by bastards, and Live and Kicking was the centre of tween culture, and the undisputed champion of Saturday mornings. And in truth, they probably still would have been if they'd been half as good, because ITV in the latter half of the 90s were a big, hot mess. The BBC had in truth mostly owned the slot since Tiswas had ended, but now they were officially the gods and masters of Saturday morning. It wasn't even close anymore. Live and Kicking ruled the world. It may have been this level of confidence that caused them to effectively abandon the Saturday morning slot altogether in the summers from 1996. Series 2 of Fully Booked was much like the first, with 3 main differences. With Zoe Ball's effective promotion, former Neighbours star Sarah Vandenberg stepped in alongside Grant Stott. More importantly, the fundamental basis of the show changed. I don't mean the premise, it was still ostensibly set in a hotel, but now it was entirely pre-recorded rather than going out live, albeit recorded in a single session with no editing. This precluded any phone-in interactivity, but made it much simpler for them to change the slot. For reasons never elaborated on, probably to do with something internal at BBC Scotland, Fully Booked was moved to Sundays on BBC Two, where we previously enjoyed a morning-long slot of regular children's BBC programme. This was moved for the summer to the old Sat.AM area under the name Saturday Aardvark, because it was largely presented by CBBC's puppet star at the times, Otis the Aardvark. But it doesn't count as a Sat.AM show in the same way, because it really was just the usual post-broom-covered CBBC business, with marginally more effort in the links. Fully Booked's move didn't do it any favours. It already couldn't help but feel like a poor relation simply by dint of being a summer replacement. Moving it to Sundays and BBC Two could never have felt like anything but a demotion, It was like they'd given it a new coat of paint, but in a hitherto unknown sort of finish called lame. It pottered along in its new slot for a further 3 series before being taken back to the shop for a refit. It emerged as effectively a completely different show. The hotel premise was basically dropped, the entire cast humanely destroyed and replaced, and it basically transformed into a lightweight live and kicking, which was fine. Still pre-recorded and still going out on Sundays though, and therefore still missing the point. Not that the BBC really cared that much. Ratings are negligible when the sign is out, especially in the morning, which is part of the reason behind summer replacements in the first place. It's the wet and cold autumn to spring months that matter, and they had those tied up with constrictor knots. But nothing lasts forever.